The fog always arrived before she did. In the year 1874, the small woodland village slept beneath a blanket of quiet dread, unaware that something impossible was moving between the trees. They would later call her Mary Whitmore, though no one could remember who gave her that name, or why it felt like it had always belonged to her. What they did remember was the sound, soft barefoot steps on dead leaves, stopping just beyond the reach of lantern light. When she first appeared, she did not scream, cry, or beg for help. She simply stood at the edge of the forest, watching. Her dress was torn and soaked with mist, her pale hands hanging motionless, as if she had forgotten how to use them. Her eyes, however, were alive with a strange awareness, like she was looking through people instead of at them. The villagers who dared to meet her gaze felt something crawl up their spines, an instinct older than fear, whispering that she did not belong to the world they understood. They tried to help her. Of course they did. Kind hands led her into warmth, gave her bread and water, wrapped her in blankets. But she never spoke. Not once. Doctors came from neighboring towns, men of learning and sharpened tools, who studied her breath, her pulse, the faint tremor in her fingers. They listened to her heart and stepped away in silence, their faces drained of color. There was nothing wrong with her, they said. And yet everything felt wrong when she was near. At night, she would sit by the window, staring back toward the dark line of trees. Not moving. Not blinking. Just waiting. And on the third night, the fog grew thicker than ever before, pressing against the glass like a living thing, and from deep within the forest, something answered her stare. For years, the woods near the village had been a place of quiet superstition, where children were warned not to wander and adults avoided after sunset. Fallen branches twisted into unnatural shapes, and the fog often moved as if guided by hidden breath. People believed the forest remembered things it should have forgotten. Long before anyone noticed the girl's arrival, there were stories of distant doctors passing through, men carrying locked cases and books wrapped in dark leather, never speaking of their work and never staying long. Mary Whitmore's presence slowly brought those old stories back to the surface. She was always gentle, always silent, never causing trouble, which made the discovery all the more disturbing when it finally happened. It was not fear that led to it, but care. A woman trying to clean mud from Mary's arms noticed faint, pale lines near her wrists, the kind that only appear when light hits skin at the right angle. At first, they looked like childhood scratches or faded wounds from long ago. But as more of her sleeve was lifted, the pattern revealed itself. The lines were not random. They curved and crossed with a careful order, forming shapes too precise to be accidents. Small circles joined by straight strokes. Tiny triangular cuts placed exactly where veins pulsed closest to the surface. The scars were old, healed cleanly, and placed with intention. Whoever had done this knew anatomy. They understood where to cut without killing. Word did not spread through shouting. It moved in whispers. People leaned closer when they spoke. Curtains were drawn tighter in the evenings. A few brave souls brought out forgotten trunks and opened books that had not seen daylight in decades. Inside some of those books were sketches that made their stomachs tighten, symbols nearly identical to the ones branded into Mary's skin. Writings spoke of experimental practices, of physicians who believed the human body could be taught like a diagram, that knowledge could be permanently written into flesh. The realization crept in slowly and cruelly. This child had not simply been lost. She had been used. Her body had been turned into a page for someone else's work. A living record of something that should never have left the shadows. After that day, the way people touched her changed. Their hands hesitated. Their smiles stiffened. Even their prayers felt heavier. And Mary, though she said nothing, began pulling her sleeves down more tightly, as if she felt the invisible shift in the air, and understood that the quiet life she had known was already slipping away from her bit by bit. The village doctor had a reputation built over decades, a man whose steady hands had delivered children and closed the eyes of the dead with the same calm respect. When he agreed to examine Mary Whitmore, the villagers felt a strange sense of relief, as though order was finally returning to a story that had slipped into darkness. He prepared his small clinic with care, arranging polished instruments, clean cloths, and a lantern that burned brighter than usual, its flame uneasy in the growing fog. Mary sat silently on the wooden chair while he worked. He checked her pulse, steady and warm. He lifted her eyelids and studied the faint reflection of the flame in her pupils. He pressed lightly along her neck, her wrists, and the strange patterns carved into her arms. He wrote everything down. Every detail. Every hesitation. Every pause when his tools touched her skin. At first, his face showed only curiosity, the familiar expression of a man studying a problem with no clear solution. But as the minutes passed, the change in him became impossible to ignore. His jaw tightened. His pen slowed. His breathing grew shallow. He began turning pages back and forth, comparing what he saw to sketches he pulled from a locked drawer in his desk. The calm man the village trusted started to unravel in silence. A thin line of sweat appeared along his temple, and his hands developed a faint, uncontrollable tremor. Suddenly, without explanation, he stopped. He stared at Mary as if she had become something other than a child. Something older. Something deliberate. He reached for the papers he had been writing and, one by one, held them to the lantern flame. The pages curled, blackened, and disappeared into ash. The smell of burning ink and parchment filled the room, thick and choking. He said nothing to anyone when they asked what he had found. Not one word. He shut himself inside the clinic and barred the door from within, refusing food, refusing visitors, refusing prayer. At night, when the rest of the village lay restless in their beds, strange sounds began to come from behind his locked door. Scratching. Shuffling footsteps. The slow dragging of metal across wood. Sometimes, a muffled voice could be heard, trembling, repeating the same broken phrase again and again, though Northwest one dared stand close enough to make out the words. Within days, the man they had trusted all their lives was gone from the world they understood. His windows remained dark. His lantern unlit. His hands, once steady and gentle, now hidden behind walls that felt thinner with every passing night, as if whatever he had seen on Mary's skin had followed him in and refused to let him go. The forest had always kept its secrets beneath roots and soil, but there came a night when the earth itself seemed unwilling to stay quiet. It started with a strange pattern noticed by a group of men searching for firewood, patches of ground where moss refused to grow, arranged in a rough circle as if the land had been disturbed long ago and never healed. The air was colder there, heavy and stale, and even the wind moved differently, slipping between the trees without sound. Driven by fear more than courage, they returned with shovels and lanterns, their breath fogging the cold night air. Each thrust into the ground felt like trespassing into something buried on purpose. The soil gave way easier than it should have, and within hours they struck wood, old and brittle. A rotten hatch, half collapsed, hidden under a mat of leaves and roots. Someone long ago had worked hard to make sure it would never be found. When the hatch finally broke open, a rush of air escaped from below, smelling of metal, damp earth, and something far older. A narrow set of steps descended into darkness. The men hesitated, but the silence behind them felt just as threatening as what waited below. One by one, they went down. The underground room was small, carved roughly from stone and reinforced with splintered beams. Rusted medical instruments lay strewn across a wooden table, saws dulled by time, clamps frozen in place, glass bottles clouded with ancient residue. In the corner stood a narrow iron bed, its frame twisted and stained by rust so dark it looked like old, dried shadows. On it lay nothing but silence. But the floor told a different story. Fine dust covered the stone like a thin blanket, untouched for what should have been decades. And yet, pressed clearly through it, were small footprints. Child-sized. Bare. Fresh. The sight drained the breath from every chest in the room. No one spoke. No one moved. The lantern flames flickered violently, throwing the shadows of the tools high up the walls so they seemed to twitch and reach. The footprints led to the bed, and then stopped. No return steps. No trail back toward the stairs. Just an abrupt end, as if the child had vanished into the air itself. When they finally climbed back into the cold night, the forest no longer felt like merely a place of old stories. It felt awake. Watchful. As if it had noticed their intrusion and was now quietly deciding what would happen next. And somewhere between the twisted branches and shifting fog, the feeling settled into their bones that the room had not been abandoned for as long as they had believed, and whatever had once used that place was no longer buried with it.